Hello and welcome into week 2. It brings us so much joy that you're continuing to meet with one another. God's word is abundantly clear that we're to meet with one another, to encourage one another, and to bear one another's burdens. And that's exactly what you're doing. Last week we discussed what it means to be a disciple and how it starts with being with Jesus. Well, today we're going to continue that conversation. And we're going to explore how we can be with Jesus, how we can follow Jesus, even if things aren't going as smoothly as we'd like for them to be going. Today we're going to be looking at 2 examples of how we can do this. One comes from the disciple Peter. We're going to continue to look at the life of Peter and how he was with Jesus, how he followed Jesus even when things were rocky. We're also going to be looking at a real life example of somebody who's steeped in St. Mark culture. But before we dive into any of that, pause and read today's scripture with your group.
As we read this passage in Matthew, it's sometimes really easy to focus on that part where Jesus looks at Peter in verse 31 and says, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" I think we've all been there though. God calls us to something and we take that step of faith and then something distracts us and we get caught off guard and we begin to fear. We begin to let that doubt sink in. But what if Jesus wasn't scolding Peter in that moment? What if he was actually trying to remind Peter of the thing he had been trying to teach him all along? Faith. But not just the head knowledge, the actual heart-changing, life-changing faith that comes from following Jesus. So just before this in Matthew 14, Jesus was with his disciples on the mountainside and he was teaching. And it became so late in the day that the disciples were really worried that the people were getting hungry and stir crazy and you got kids running around. You get it. And they go to Jesus and they're like, "Hey, we need to feed these people." And so long story short, because this is not our story today, Jesus takes 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish and he multiplies it and feeds thousands and thousands of people sitting on this mountainside. And in the end of that, something that I love is that at the end there were 12 basketfuls left over. 1 basket for each disciple, including Peter. So just after this, Jesus, he departs to the mountainside to pray and recover from his day, and he sends the disciples to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. And while he's away from them, he decides, I think it's been long enough, it's time to go find them, but it's the middle of the night, and they're not close to shore, and so you can't call out to them, so Jesus does the next logical thing, and he takes a walk, right? Now, the disciples are out there alone, and they're probably not expecting to see any other boats. It's the middle of the night, and they're definitely not expecting to see someone walk on water. Are you with me? So no wonder they were scared. Like, we all read that, and we're like, well, why were they scared? It was Jesus. But if you look at the context, there's no way they thought that was Jesus walking out to them. And I've been on the Sea of Galilee, and just looking at the surroundings, the mountains, the way it's shaped, I don't think it would take much for this tiny fishing boat that they were on to get swept up in the wind and the waves. So the circumstances are kind of wild. They are getting tossed about by the wind. They see this person walking towards them. They're going to be confused. They're going to be scared. But what happens when Peter realizes it's Jesus, he steps into his slightly impulsive but daring self, and he does something that no one else in that boat is willing to do. He sees Jesus walking on the water, and then he asks Jesus for his next step. So Jesus did not have to invite Peter to come out onto that water with him if he thought it was dangerous. And Peter didn't have to open himself up to this miraculous encounter with the Lord. But in true fashion of testing what he was learning, Peter asked Jesus to give him a bold next step to grow his faith. Now, we saw that Peter jumped in the water. And this is someone who had just watched Jesus multiply food so that he could feed over 5,000 people. He was an eyewitness to the fact that not only Jesus cares about the spiritual side of our relationship with him, but our physical needs. And Jesus, who had just sent the disciples with a basket of food, one for each of them, cares about the details of their life. And this is just a glimpse of the many moments Peter had spent with Jesus to be challenged in faith and understanding the way that Jesus had come to change the perspective of the Jews in their relationship with God and turn it upside down. Peter was with Jesus. He spent time getting to know Jesus. His understanding of who Jesus was went far beyond this moment on the Sea of Galilee. But I'm sure he could recall many moments where Peter's faith had grown in his relationship with Jesus. But to know Jesus on a surface level and really knowing who Jesus is sometimes means that we have to step out of our comfort zone to change it from a head knowledge to a heart knowledge. Peter wanted to know Jesus more. That's very clear. And that is why he jumped out of the boat when Jesus called him. That's why he took this step of faith. So when Jesus looks at Peter and says, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" I think it's this gentle reminder to say, Peter, we've been through some stuff together. And Peter, you know this in your heart, not just your mind, that I am here to take care of you. We can't fault Peter for being scared. Peter was a human, and like many of us, he couldn't trust himself to withstand the wind and the waves that were surrounding him. But Peter also knew that the God who fed the 5,000 and the God who can calm storms and the God who can walk on water, Jesus, was also there to reach out his hand and grab him when he fell. Just because we have faith in Jesus and we spend time with Jesus and we see him work in our lives, it doesn't mean that we'll never fall or fail or mess up again, does it? But it does mean that we can have faith that whatever God calls us to, he will be there to reach out a hand and pick us up when we take a misstep, when we get distracted by the wind and the waves around us. And just like Peter, if we are with Jesus, the longer we are with Jesus, the more we get to see him work in our lives, the more we can know and understand when things get hard, that we're not failing, we are just growing deeper in faith. So here today is my friend Brent with a story of how he spent time with Jesus, getting to know him, and it led him to great steps of faith and stepping out of the boat.
Hi, I'm Brent Reimer, and this is my story. I was serving in church capacity at Zion Missionary Church in the 90s, and I found myself very comfortable and excited about ministry. Yet there was always just a little bit of a what if out there. Like, what if God had something more? What if there was something out there that I should be doing that I wasn't doing? And I've always had missions as a big part of my heart. And so in church ministry, I would go on small missions trips and do things like short-term ministry teams. One of those opportunities was to go along with a group to Jamaica to build a basketball court and help a ministry move forward. And we arrived and thought this was a great opportunity, and we were full of energy, and it became very apparent pretty quickly that without proper equipment, without proper resources, this was going to be an incredibly difficult task, if not impossible. And as we went through the week, we faced incredible odds, including the heaviest, most dense rainfall I've ever seen in my life, washing out our project and making it pretty much impossible. But through that, the Lord started working in our hearts to draw closer to him and to lean on him in those times of adversity, rather than just kind of go within ourselves and to think about how we can do it more on our own power. We had to lean on him in these impossible odds. And I came home from that trip with this feeling of something's different. Something is abnormal. Something is stirring in my heart. And for the next few months, I didn't know exactly what it was, but I knew God was doing a work. And I thought to myself, I need to just double down in times of this. Instead of going inward to myself, I need to go inward or upward to the Lord and really spend time with him. And eventually God revealed to me that was a call to missions. and that was a call to get involved in some specific missions opportunities and to step out of my comfort zone in ministry where I was comfortable in church ministry and to step out into an unknown ministry position for him yet to reveal that to me. Several years later, after serving in a missions capacity for several years, I went back into a regular secular job. And as I was working that job, again, sensed the Lord's tugging, sensing something that he wanted more from me. And so as I explored that and thought about that, I sensed that God was saying, okay, it's time to get again out of your comfort zone and get into something, allow me to put you into something that's maybe a little less comfort and a little bit more leaning on me. And so as I explored that and pursued the Lord in that, it became quite evident that there was missionaries calling me from Fiji to use my skills that I had honed over several years of doing missions and use those in a very specific capacity in Fiji. And it took a few more years of going back and forth part-time, but then I found myself as a full-time missionary once again overseas in Fiji. It was wonderful to use those skills that I had honed over several years of missions and ministry, again, for a very specific purpose in Fiji, and to see God bringing these things together in my life. It took some stepping out for sure, from being comfortable to stepping into the unknown. And that was something that, even though I had done it years past and had done it over the years in little steps, to do it again afresh sometimes is as a new challenge for us, and sometimes takes as big of a step of faith as we remember taking if we've done it before. So I love that God doesn't exactly just give us a formula and a path. He says, I want you to step out and I want you to step forward. Step out of your comfort and step forward into something I have for you. Choosing to follow Jesus doesn't always mean we're going to be perfect in every situation. We definitely have times where we kind of go backwards inside ourselves and say, I could have been bolder, or I could have been sharper, I could have said that. There are those moments, but God has a lot of mercy for us, and oftentimes we'll bring those situations back around or allow us to maybe plant a seed that somebody else may water. And so I give myself some grace that way, but I also know that, I need to take those opportunities and use those moments for the best of the kingdom. To sum up, my advice to someone who wants to follow Jesus more closely would be to remember it's a marathon and not a sprint. It's not about getting there first. It's about following Jesus step by step and taking steps each day to be more close to him. I think we each have the choice to daily say, I'm going to step more closely to Jesus or step more far away from Jesus. And so my hope and prayer is that each of us, whether a new Christian or whether it's someone who has been following Jesus for their whole life, my encouragement would be to follow Jesus more closely today than we were yesterday, and more closely tomorrow than we are today. And just take those steps. Maybe it's getting into the Word more. Maybe it's getting into a prayer group or getting together with people in a different situation. But choosing to believe that God is calling us to something greater for his kingdom and choosing to step into that.
What a wonderful example of what it means to follow Jesus, to be with Jesus, even when things were uncertain. God is always calling you, and he's always calling me to continue to be with him, to follow him more closely. And sometimes that means getting outside of our comfort zone, as we saw with Peter and as we saw with Brent. So take some time as a group. Discuss what it means to follow Jesus more closely, even if that means stepping out of your comfort zone.